Hey friends, I'm Remy. Welcome. So, I've been a little bit on the low side recently regarding my mood. Just with everything that's going on in the world and, stresses of life. I've just needed a little break from some of the more intense things. And so my reading recently has reflected that. And because of that, I decided to just come along and recommend 10 cozy books in case anybody out there is looking for a good cozy recommendation. It just happened to be 10. I didn't plan it out like this. But yeah, let's jump into the books. So the first one I'm going to recommend, of course, is Legends and... I'm kidding. Legends and Lattes, great cozy book, but you've all heard of it already. If you're looking for cozy book recommendations, you've probably already read that one. If you haven't, it's definitely worth a read, though. Anyway, the real first book that I'm going to recommend is A Man Called Ove. Now, this is a little bit more of a popular one. You've probably heard of it before if you're in online book spaces. But anyway, this is a really cozy novel about an older gentleman who's kind of done with life. His wife passed a little while ago. He doesn't have any kids. He doesn't really have anyone in his life, and he's just grown old and bitter because of that. He's always been a little bitter, just because of the way that his life has turned out. We uncover why he is the way that he is, and we also go along with him as he makes new friends through the circumstances that he's finding himself in, and how he changes over time from, a grumpy old man who wants nothing to do with anyone and forces everybody to follow the most minute rules that don't matter at all, into a slightly less grumpy old man who is a little bit more lenient with the rules and will really go out of his way to help people who he cares about. Although this man is old and decrepit and hates everything and kind of just wants to not be here anymore, he's still a good person. He's still got a good heart. He'll do what needs to be done for the people around him. He's a really sweet guy, even though he's got a really hard exterior. This book is pretty straightforward, pretty simple. The plot never goes too deep, although it still has a good impact and you still feel very connected to the characters. This is a great book to just sit down in bed, snuggle up in the covers, and just have a good time for a while. It's not that long. It's very easy to read. The plot's straightforward, but it's still impactful. I would highly recommend A Man Called Ove. The next book that I want to talk about is one that I just finished, The Long Way to a Small Angry Planet. I just finished this a week ago, maybe, and I really loved it. It was very good. It was very touching. This book does have some stakes. There are some things going on in the plot that get pretty intense for a little bit, and maybe not everything's going to turn out exactly all right. So it's not cozy in the way that there's nothing happening, but it is cozy in the way that the characters interact with each other, the way they go out of their way to understand each other and meet each other where they're at. This being a sci-fi book with a bunch of different alien species, it's really set up to have those conversations about how people are different from each other and how people have different needs and different ways of expressing themselves, and how we need to meet people where they're at, and how people should also try and meet us where we're at and resolve our differences to get along as best as we can. This book accomplishes that very well without ever being preachy or over the top. It is so sweet, it is so lovely, and I love it for that. Another one of my favorite books that I'm going to recommend to you, it's also fairly popular, Tress of the Emerald Sea by Brandon Sanderson. This was the first Sanderson book that I read, and I am so glad that I started with this one because it's one of my favorite books of all time. Even though it does apparently spoil some of the things with the Cosmere later on, I don't care. I loved it. I ate it up. This book is all about a young woman who lives on an island, and she falls in love with a prince, and then the prince gets kidnapped. And instead of just sitting around hoping that the prince comes back home safely or gets rescued by somebody, she decides to get up and go and leave the island that she's not even supposed to be allowed to leave. She has to sneak off the island and go rescue him. It's very cozy. It's very sweet. All of these books are. Well, all but one, and we'll get to that one in a little bit. Have you seen The Princess Bride? Brandon Sanderson said that he was inspired by it quite a bit. He wrote this story for his wife based off of some inspiration from The Princess Bride, and you can definitely see it throughout here. It's basically The Princess Bride if Buttercup, instead of just moaning Wesley's death, if she actually got up and went and tried to save him. That's basically this book. It very much has the whimsical fantasy vibes of a fairy tale, and I love it for that. There's still a lot of great world building in here that you would expect for Brandon Sanderson. There's not exactly magic in the world, but the setting, the actual world that they're on, and the world building in that is basically a magic system in and of itself, and it is so fascinating. It was such a great idea. If you're at all interested in anything that I've said about this book, you should go read it because it's very good. Okay, I'm going to stop rambling about Tress and move on. Okay, so this is the first graphic novel that I'm going to recommend. There's two, and this one is On a Sunbeam by Tilly Walden. I read this one, I think, late last year. It's a pretty thick graphic novel, but even still, it's a graphic novel, so it's going to go by fairly fast. This has some of the most beautiful art that I've ever seen in a graphic novel. Some of the panels are genuinely breathtaking. The use of color throughout this book is amazing. Anyway, about the plot, it's about two young girls at basically a boarding school, and they're basically both outcasts, and they find each other and start hanging out and developing a friendship, and eventually a little bit more than a friendship. And then some other things happen in the story that I won't spoil. But the relationship between these two girls and the lengths that they go to figure themselves out and to do what they can to take care of the other one is very sweet. I will say that in the later half of the book, the world building gets a little weak and was a little distracting for me, because I think that this is geared towards, like, in between middle grade and young adult is probably what this book was intended for. I still enjoyed it, of course, and I still think adults can enjoy it too. But just know that the world building does get a little bit weak in the later half. Okay, the second and last graphic novel that I'm going to recommend is my favorite book that I've ever read, and it is Blankets by Craig Thompson. This book, when I read it, I really felt understood. I felt seen. Craig Thompson's autobiography of how he grew up in rural Michigan, which is where I grew up, and conflicts with his brother. I don't have a brother, but like I had similar conflicts with my sisters. And him exploring his belief in God, his religion, his family dynamics, his first love, becoming an artist, and really coming into his own and understanding who he is and what he wants from life. And when I read it, I was on a boat in the middle of the sea for months at a time. And, just around the same people. Can't get away, can't really be by yourself for very long. So reading this was really like almost like a religious experience. And I think that in no small part has to do with why it's my favorite book of all time. It's still very good, of course. I think even without being in that specific experience, I still would have liked it quite a bit, but that definitely heightened it for me. And the art in here is also extraordinarily beautiful. Everything I've seen from Craig Thompson just has a whimsical element to it. He meshes the visuals and what's happening in the plot of the story together so well to really become one. Like, you could not have the impact just being text or just being the images. He really meshes the two so well. Now, the next book I'm going to recommend isn't cozy in the traditional sense. It's Misery by Stephen King. And this is a thriller about a writer getting trapped in a cabin by his biggest fan. Not exactly a recipe for a cozy story. So there's a lot of horrific stuff that happens in this book. It's very violent at times and gruesome, and it's pretty intense, and especially if you listen to the audiobook version like I did originally, it gets gross at times. Although I think that the audiobook narrator did an outstanding job. It is so good. Highly recommended. This book is cozy in the way that this guy is just trapped in a cabin in the middle of winter. he can't really go anywhere. He can't really care for himself in any real way. The book itself isn't cozy, but there's a cozy feeling to reading it when this guy's just trapped in there. He can't leave. He's just snowed into the cabin. I'm having a hard time describing why I feel this fits into the cozy category, because it's not cozy in the sense of what the story is about. There's just a certain coziness that comes along with reading a thriller horror book in the middle of winter, just, snuggled up under a blanket in your room, maybe in bed, and just immersing yourself in this great story about a guy basically being tortured in a cabin that he can't leave. This, of course, isn't going to hit for everybody, especially when it comes to the cozy genre, because this book really isn't there. But for me, it has the same kind of cathartic feeling that I'm looking for when I'm looking for a cozy book. And so that's why I'm including it. Your mileage may vary. Okay, the next one definitely is traditionally cozy, and it is The Little Prince. This is such a fantastic book. It is short, it is small, it is a children's book that can be read in a single sitting if you really want to, although I would recommend probably breaking it up into a couple if you really want to properly enjoy it. But it's about this little boy traveling through the universe, visiting different planets, and talking to people on there, and how everybody is so obsessed with matters of importance. Things that they have told themselves are important and that they need to care about. But in the grand scheme of things, to this little boy at least, don't matter at all. And it's all about finding out what you care about and doing what you love. And it is so... I'm saying this for all the books, but it's so sweet. It is such a good experience. And even though it is, more of a children's book, there's some very good lessons in here that, nothing groundbreaking, but still good things to remind yourself of. So if you haven't read it, or if you haven't read it recently, revisit this little gem. It's very good. Okay, and then there's 2 more books that I'm going to recommend, and these I'm recommending mostly for nostalgia reasons. And so these might not be strictly applicable to you, but I'm sure that you can find some kind of parallel with something that you read in your childhood. And for me, it's How to Train Your Dragon. I've been rereading this series. I'm going to start book 4 probably later tonight. And this is a middle grade book. They're all short, they're all small, but the nostalgia of coming back to something that I read and loved as a child, it's been such a good experience. These aren't amazing books. They're full of Deus Ex Machina moments, where the heroes are in danger and everything's doomed, and then, God reaches down and just gives them exactly what they need and they wind up okay. That being said, they're not bad books. The How to Train Your Dragon series, although they are, plot-wise kind of a joke, they're still very charming. There's a lot of humor in here. There's a lot of humor in here geared towards children, which, is kind of hit or miss. But there's also just a lot of clever humor that I still find funny in the way that Cressida Cowell writes these books. She's very clever. And even though they are children's books, I feel like a lot of the writing is still pretty enjoyable, especially if you read these as a kid. If you haven't read these as a kid, I wouldn't recommend that you pick them up. But if you have a kid, or if you did read these as a kid, I would recommend these very strongly. There's 12 of them. I've read, I think, 10. So I'm rereading them to just finish the series and revisit the nostalgia that I had. And the other one going along with the nostalgia trip is what I'm going to read after I finish those. And it's Percy Jackson and the Olympians. This one is The Lightning Thief. I read the entire first series when I was a kid, and then I read 2.5 of the next series, The Heroes of Olympus, I think. I don't know. But even though these definitely do not fall into the cozy vibe, in and of themselves, How to Train Your Dragon kind of does, but these not at all. Except for the fact, of course, that, I have the nostalgia for them growing up. I reread this one 2 years ago, and it wasn't, not gonna lie, it wasn't great. But I do have very good memories of specifically the 5th book in this series. So I'm hoping that they're going to get a little bit better as I go on. And if they don't, then I'll just put them down. But yeah, these last 2 book recommendations are basically just to urge you to revisit something that you used to love, something when you were younger, something that you cherished. It's going to be different, and it's going to change how you view it for sure. You're going to see a lot more flaws than you did when you were younger. And that does have the possibility of kind of corrupting it for you. You know, this thing that you love so much, isn't as good as you remember it in some ways. But depending on what it is, there might be a lot more to appreciate now that you didn't realize when you were younger. So it might be a little bit of a risk because it might ruin it for you, but it could also be very much worth it to revisit that nostalgia, as well as to, uncover a lot of the things that you didn't see when you were younger. So yeah, revisit something that you used to love. Anyway, that is all the cozy book recommendations that I have right now. If you have any more cozy book recommendations, please tell me, because I'm definitely in the mood for that right now. And yeah, thank you so much for watching. If you liked, I would love it if you'd leave a like and subscribe if you want to see more. If you have any opinions about the books that I talked about, I'd love to hear them. And yeah, hopefully I will see you in the next one. Peace.